that's kind of unfulfilled because I'm not there. But then I'm not even in Minnesota, I'm in Kolkata. For all kinds of health-related reasons, I couldn't make it. So apologies for that, and it's my loss entirely. I miss meeting my friend Shripad, whose mustard yellow sari I got a glimpse of in the last panel. I saw them sitting at the back. Um, Thanks a lot to CLPR for organizing these conversations, and thanks for being so accommodating and allowing me to be on Zoom here. I apologize in advance for some background noise. There's a person relentlessly coughing in the other room while the house is being torn down in the neighborhood. So there's real estate, health, everything going on as we are talking about democracy and transness. And whatever I'm going to talk about today is kind of from some recent encounters and conversations that I've been having over the last few months. And not really a coherent set of comments, but more like thoughts. So it's very interesting to hear Chris and their critique of services, and I'm completely on board with them, but I am starting from a position of services, and hopefully at some point, but through services, I want to kind of reach that moment of agreement with Chris. So specifically, what I have been thinking about is where are the elderly in all our conversations on trans democracy. And in my personal capacity, like there are a few of us, an organization and a couple of individuals. Now, when I say individual, of course, nobody is an individual. There are infrastructures which enable us to do things. We have been looking after a group of elderly trans persons, and we will be there in a couple of decades. So it's not any favor being done, but what I'm basically going to talk about are a series of bottlenecks that we have been facing in kind of providing this care. So one particular incident, this particular person who is 65 years old, partially paralyzed, and we've been looking after her. And but at the same time, the expenses are increasing, right? And even though we are in the middle of the pandemic still, there is this illusion that's being created that we are in the post of the pandemic, which is to say that funds are drying up. So during the first two waves of the pandemic, there were a series of fundraisers, and NGOs which had unused funds could you do some creative accounting and channel those funds into emergency relief, raising rations. But that kind of has that those kind of funds have started drying up. So then where do we stand today? Because the needs are not disappearing anywhere, right? And so that is where I want to highlight this question of services and this kind of dichotomy that is created between services and rights. So to give some concrete examples, and this is something that I've witnessed firsthand, during the first and the second wave, when a lot of organizations were raising resources to give ration kits to the homeless and the destitute and trans person, as if those identities don't intersect. Have we had many conversations on the quality of the rice grains? So the moment we think of food as a service and not connected to the question of right to dignity, right to nourishment, right to a balanced diet, therefore that division comes into play, whereby an NGO can feel complacent giving coarse grains to the recipients, right? And so many organizations across the country which have been running these massive fundraisers to raise to basically buy rations, there hasn't really been many conversations on the quality of the ration kits. And now even those kits have resources have started dwindling. That's one point. And so then that question of, is it really, can we think of service as not service, but as a right. Um, and then connected to that question is some recent conversations where funders are saying that we cannot provide funding for purchasing medicines any longer. That was an emergency period, and therefore we were making those provisions, but no longer. That's not possible anymore. So then here we are with a structure whereby all the labors get individualized and care is decided based on personal equations and not care as a right of every person, because there are no structures in place where uh, care can be demanded as a right. So, for instance, if we look at what the complete lack of structures, if we just go a little deeper into that, um, we have the Trans Act, and then we have this the National Council for Trans Persons, right? And these Garima Grihas, oddly titled Garima Grihas, Garima roughly meaning dignity, I guess, but then these Garima Grihas, these shelter homes across the country that have come up, if we really look at the kind of infrastructures that they have been given, in the eligibility criteria, it says that the age limit is between 18 and 60. Now, of course, what happens to those beyond 60? And then in the second eligibility criteria, it says that the trans persons who can be the inmates of these Garima Grihas cannot be sex workers and cannot be involved in begging, right? So then again, that question of service and right comes in, because here is this home, shelter home, which is titled the Dignity Home, but it does not recognize dignity of labor. And it sees itself as a service provider whereby inmates come there for a fixed period of time and then they are imparted with skill development courses, training, and then at the end of a year they will have to basically move out and implement those skill development training that they have picked from the Garima Griha and apply it in the real world. Now, what are the kind of skill development training that's happening here? Now, if one goes to the website, we only see a lot of photographs of the persons living there, cooking, knitting, and thread work, tailoring. Basically, just reminding one of the charity-based Nari Niketans that have been functioning in the country for such a long time, which don't really run by feminist principles, but more in terms of the idea of seva, right? So it's not really about labor; it's about and because the moment one talks in terms of labor, then the question of rights and dignity and democracy come up. But then that is not the idea. The idea is one of service provisions. So now in all this skill development process, someone who is 65 years old, who is partially paralyzed, is not a productive person, right? It's not a productive citizen to be part of this kind of a framework. So definitely such a person does not have space in this kind of a quote unquote dignity home, right? So the organization, myself, who have been looking after who have been kind of caretakers of these people, we have had conversations with these Garima Grihas, quite a few of them. Like the city of Calcutta, Kolkata has two Garima Grihas. One of the Garima Grihas said that their kitchen is on the third floor and the bedrooms are on the ground floor, and so obviously that precludes the possibility of a partially paralyzed person to be in that shelter home. If not, if even if some kind of allowances were to be made in terms of the outer limit of age, but the very architecture of the building does not allow the possibility, does not imagine access, right? Person, is it the owners of any person to be a friendly personality so that care can be imparted? So that is that I think that is a very important question for the idea of democracy, and that is also my little critique of the idea of valorization of chosen family in queer and trans spaces. Because the moment we think of the chosen family, I don't think we have developed enough critical language to even think about what are the infrastructures that cohere around this idea of that enable the chosen family. Of course, our caste class privileges, our affiliations, what we like, what we don't like. In trans spaces, sartorial preferences, who is masculine enough, who is feminine enough, who passes, who doesn't pass. There are all these multiple layers of questions, right? Which become important when we think of the chosen family. So if a person is not likable, then that person cannot be part of the chosen family, and therefore that person doesn't deserve care. And so these were a couple of bottlenecks that came up, and that brought up these very generalized questions of how do we think of care, how do we think of services, and how do we think about the right to dignity. Another important point that came up that has been coming up during this whole episode is that the fact that because we have been having these conversations about the need for creating these structures whereby this particular individual and many like her can continue to receive care, whether we are personally involved or not. So when we are looking for these structures, some of us even approached disability rights groups, which are also connected to several shelter homes and old age homes in West Bengal. Now, the bottleneck that we have been facing here is that, of course, they've been asking for the medical records. And every time I go there, or some of us go there with the medical history of these particular people, the moment the question of HIV comes up, and that becomes a strict no, right? So then, now it would be simplistic to assume that it is simply a stigma based on the HIV status of a person. It's not. It's not that. The thing is that an elderly person is not supposed to be a sexual person, and HIV becomes a signal. It almost signals an active sex life, and so one doesn't really need to get into the nitty gritty of one's viral load, or whether one is undetectable, or all those details. The very fact of the HIV report is a signal that this person probably has an active sexual life, and if that is the case, how can this person live in this kind of a space whereby you are basically you have to spend your day almost meditating. So if one looks at goes into the further detail of the routines of many of these spaces, they have very strict routines that you wake up at 7:30, you pray for 15 minutes, you line up for breakfast, then you do some meditation, or you go to the playroom, you do some knitting work, you watch TV, you again eat, you make some craft, and so throughout the whole day there is these strict protocols about that are necessary to be able to belong in that space, right? And so there is no space for imagining sex, imagining pleasure, and so every time we go to these spaces, and every time we talk to them, they ask us, will this person be disciplined? Now, we just say that, what do you mean by discipline? No, I mean, if you look at the medical history, we are not sure any longer. So you see how the conversations keep happening in silos, right? In trans spaces, when there is complete lack of access, there is no imagining of access, right? And then in the disability space, there is no imagination of one accessing one's gender in an affirmative manner, which could happen through mutual pleasure, or through finding a partner, maybe in that space or maybe outside. How as someone how do we then ethically think of a space where an elderly trans person will find home which is accessible, but accessible not in terms of them being able to access every aspect of the architecture of that space, but also in terms of accessing their own bodies, and accessing pleasure, right? So these questions keep coming up again and again, and that always comes back to that question of this kind of false dichotomy that is created between this question of services and rights, because this food and medicines and shelter is mostly thought in terms of services, that the question of dignity, the question of labor, these questions just go missing. If we start thinking of these services, if we start rethinking this question of services in terms of rights, then perhaps we can imagine those, what Viquer was just saying, the impossible, like a space where my trans mother can have as much sex as she wants and also access all the spaces. And right now we don't have that kind of a support system. Oh, and then the Garima Grihas also have CCTV cameras all around, right? So the constant surveillance and policing that happen in these spaces. So then how do we really think of, how do we really imagine these spaces? And finally, just to end on a very tedious, boring, but an important note, are the question of the current the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which has been completely redone, and what it means. It has only increased surveillance further. So non-profits who would even try and imagine such kind of spaces have to think twice before even imagining them, right? Because because I was just looking at the statistics between 2011 and 2019. FCRE registration certificates of 20,675 NGOs have been cancelled, of which 16,746, like 81%, was during the current government, right? So organizations are also extremely afraid of talking about rights and dignity. In some sense, then thinking of livelihood schemes, livelihood generation, empowerment becomes far more safer to talk about transness, to talk about gender identity. But in that process, these fundamental questions of dignity and rights and demanding the impossible go missing. So then what I want to leave with is this question of how do we really imagine, how do we improvise, and how do we innovate at a time when there is so much surveillance? How do we metaphorically, literally break those CCTV cameras and have rampant sex or access our genders irrespective of our age and irrespective of our abilities and irrespective of these whole Savarna ideas of purity, pollution, touch, non-touch, HIV, non-HIV? That's where I'll stop for now. Thank you.